Dr. Carrie Hepburn here from Compass PD, and I'm with one of my favorite colleagues, Dr. Natalie Fallert. And so she's here with us today, and we thought it would be really fun um, to just talk about education and record that today for our podcast. We have so many different things happening in education, and we've been in so many different schools and districts and states lately that we're seeing some trends. And I thought it would be just a really fun time for us to just kind of talk about some of the things that we're seeing.
So I'm going to interrupt because I love how you say we thought it would be really fun. I think people need to understand that we are total geeks about this. Like this is not
Okay,
a oh let's have this conversation today. This is a conversation that we have all the time. And so
that's
we're
true.
like, why don't we take all these geeked out moments when we go into these rabbit holes and just talk about it so that others can hear how our brains work and what we think about and how we truly live this life daily.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're so right, is that this is what we do all the time is we just talk education and we find it fun. I mean, it really is engaging and it's fun and it's interesting. So
Well, it's
it's
funny too because I'm working with a district and I'm going to go in and coach with them, and I'm doing some pre planning. And one of the teachers was like, "Well, you can do the same lesson with me that you're doing with someone else." Like she's very thoughtful, like, "Oh, you
mhm.
don't need to recreate; it'll work." And I was like, I'm sending her a message and I was like, this is like where I get my geek on. Like, no, I'm okay with
Yeah,
digging in and trying different things. And I don't
right.
have to do the same thing because that's what learning is all about. It's messy and let's try it and see if it works and then try something different or.
Yeah. So I thought we would start off with like talking about some of the common trends we've been hearing from we get emails, we get phone calls, we're in schools, we're in districts. What are some of the trends that we're hearing right now across the United States regarding education, student learning, teachers, all the things? So what are some things you're hearing?
Well, I think that it's important for people to know that I mostly work with secondary educators, so 6th through 12th grade.
Mhm.
And so the two biggest things that I'm hearing, and I think that they go hand in hand together, and that is student engagement and motivation,
Mhm.
and um, the ability to read on grade level. And so, and that looks lots of different ways. It's that, oh, my kids won't read, or, and then digging into why are they not reading? Oh, because the text is too hard for them. They don't understand it. They don't know how to read it.
Mhm.
So those two pieces of the puzzle are things that I am hearing over and over again. And again, I think that they are tied together, that if something is too difficult for you, you shut down, you walk away. Like
Mhm.
you don't engage in
Mhm.
things that you're not successful with or at, and you are and you don't understand them. At
Right.
some point, you just say, I can't do it, and you walk off. And so
Yeah.
the two definitely go hand in hand.
I work in all levels, but I'll speak from the elementary side right now is I'm hearing student engagement, student motivation, and below level. And then when you were talking about reading on, they're not reading on grade level, that's something that we're hearing and seeing, K-12, about what some trends that I'm hearing from instructional coaches and seeing in classrooms is that um, we're doing the work for them.
Right.
Like we're almost over scaffolding, and I think creating even more of a dependency cycle than we already have, that kids get stuck and they don't know what to do, and so we're stepping in and and causing that cycle to get even more dependent on the adult and the instruction.
And so like at the secondary level, you see that through, the use of just constant lectures. Like I'm going to give them all the information,
Mhm,
or I'm going to read it out loud to them because they're not reading it. But this is not something like, you ask like, what are we hearing? And I hear teachers say like, they're not engaged or they're below grade level. What I'm seeing, and so this
mm,
is where you're inferring from what is happening in these
yeah,
interactions, is that um, another layer to that is that teachers are overwhelmed. Like
Yeah.
I say we, like everyone just keeps piling more things on them. And
Mhm.
as we come out of the pandemic, the problem, everybody keeps saying our kids have lost learning or whatever. And I'm like, it's really
Mhm.
not, they haven't lost their learning. Like they missed some of it. Like it's missed
Yeah.
opportunity. And we still have to make that up, but they're still using the same state standards or national tests that they were using pre-pandemic to gauge them, and so they're all below. And so teachers are being told, like, we got to get them back up, we got to get them back up.
Mm.
They're like, I don't know how, because they're below grade level. And and
Mhm.
there are all these things that
Yeah.
are then putting even more pressure on the teacher, and they don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
And and we were just talking about this. You were talking about one of the books. Oh, I'm pointing because I know you've got the book sitting over there. Um, about how
How
you
the
can't
brain learn.
multitask, and
Yeah.
adding things on top of each other. And we just, one of us sent a link to a podcast that Doug Reeves was being talked
Yep.
about on building to impact or something,
Yep.
building for
Yep.
impact or something like that, his new book. And in there, he talks about how if you sit down and you ask, like, how many initiatives do you have going on? And there's like 40.
Mhm.
And he's like,
Mhm.
no, you need like two. Like you can only deal with one thing at a time. And so I even think about that, you know, that perspective of the teacher, like how many
Yeah.
priority standards did you narrow down to? Like, are you
Yeah.
still teaching all 40, or do you just have four? Like, you know, there are so many factors that
Yeah.
are causing all of this, that, okay, I got to read it to them because they got to get it, because we got to get through it so that they
We
can
have to
keep
hurry and
passing.
get through.
Yeah.
Mhm. It is like, this vicious cycle, and we're almost, I just talked about how we're creating this dependency cycle for, students. We're creating a dependency cycle on our teachers as well, because 'cause we'll say, "If you just do this, if you just use this resource, if you just do this with fidelity exactly as intended, then it's all gonna fix it." And, I think that has been an interesting sh maybe it's not even a shift, but it's been, I feel like, more of a focus for many places that we've talked with, um, lately, that we just have to do this one thing and it's gonna fix all of it. And really, the places that we're seeing the most growth, that we're working with and have been working with, it's places that are we're just focusing on one or two things, just like you said. Well, I think something, we've had a lot of conversations about, with teachers and with instructional coaches is, the use of technology in the classroom, and almost, a really strong dependence, relying heavily on the technology doing, like, leading the instruction kind of thing, and the teacher going through and using that technology, but the technology kind of guiding them clear through. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think sometimes it's self-inflicted from teachers. They're just like, oh, well, I have all this technology, I'm gonna use it. And I think that there
Yeah.
are also situations where um administration has kind of come in and been like, well, we expect you to be using this
Mhm.
platform program, whatever. And Carrie and you and I've had lots of conversations recently about shifting back to old school pen and paper, which I say shifting back, but I never left that. I'm
Me
a
neither.
pen and paper person. I'm the
Yeah.
person who drives down the road and will listen to an audiobook and take notes on post-it notes and have them all over my car. So we, like, it's not us shifting back to that, but really we've dug into, what is it, Revenge of the Analog and Reader Come Home. We've had a handful of books that we've been digging into,
Mhm.
and it sparked lots of conversations, not just about what's going on in education, but what's going on in our world, what we're
Mhm.
seeing in these strifes and fights on Facebook and social media, and pitting one side against the other. And we've had very in-depth conversations about technology's impact on our ability to
Mhm.
be deep critical thinkers
Mhm.
and um, open our perspectives up to
Mhm.
bias and decipher that. I don't know.
Yeah.
It goes so far beyond the classroom as to just becoming good human beings,
Right.
and it ties back into like technology.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when Dr. Fallert let me borrow her book, and I just have held on to it,
She hasn't
and
given it
I
back.
have it. Yeah, I have it, and she let me borrow this book too. So,
Then she gave it to her husband to read, so she still hasn't given me that one
I
back.
haven't given that one back either, and I have both audio as well, so I need to just purchase both books so I have them in my um, I started noticing things quite some time ago in when I was in the classroom. And so a trend that I would notice, and so I'm going to kind of take us back, is that we got smart boards. And so that was a really big deal. And I'm like really dating myself now, I know, but what do you think? 15, 16 years ago when smart boards started coming out, and it was like a big deal to have a smart board. And so we were, told you're going to get a smart board and you need to use it. And something that we started doing was somebody would say, I'll make the slides and then share the slides with everyone on the team. And it didn't take me long to figure out that when I was sharing somebody else's slide, I didn't know what I was teaching. If I created it, I knew the content better. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And so we have this thing that like I'm going to make the slides, or the slides were made 5 years ago and all these new people have switched grades. It's like it's okay. I've got the slides for that unit and we just share it and then we get up and we use it. So I don't know if anyone else has done that, but I'm going to be honest, I had done that before. And it didn't take me long to be like, A, I don't know what I'm teaching, so I can't help kids. I don't understand this. Like I can't be responsive to them. And it just didn't work for me. It was easier for me to write it on anchor chart paper or a whiteboard and model for kids that way, or pull them to the floor or go to a desk and just model it out in my reading notebook, my writing notebook, my math notebook, or science. I mean, like whatever you're doing, it was easier to do that than all of the work that it took to get the slides going. And something that I would see as I moved into a curriculum role, I would see that teachers were given slides and then they would present it, teach it, but they didn't know the content. So then they would get marked down on their evaluations, which totally stinks. Um, and then, so I would see that as a trend. And then we would see that it was kind of boring. Like the longer when we had the slides, we talked longer. And so there is some really interesting research about that, about when you're presenting with slides, you talk longer than you do when you're modeling it with kids. It tends to go faster and be more engaging.
To interject there, when I see somebody's, I hate slides or doing PowerPoints, but sometimes you
Mhm.
have to do it. I get it.
Yeah.
But whenever this is my ADHD brain, right? I'll see somebody pull their slides up and you can notice that there's, 56 of them. And you're like, oh my God, there are 56 slides. Like that's the first thing that goes through my mind. Then I'm certified speech and theater. So then I think, okay, if I only spend 30 seconds per slide, 30 seconds per 56 slides, that's 25 minutes. That's
Yeah.
25 minutes of me up there talking. And so maybe everybody should look at their Google Slides and be like, how many do I have? Because if I've got 100 and you're speaking for 50 minutes and you only have a 42-minute class, like that's not even possible. So
Yeah.
it's also interesting. I love that you say that, it takes more time, and it does. Like, who's doing the work here?
Hmm.
And we know that like when you do the work, you do the learning. And so I 100% agree with you that I work with an entity right now, and we go into different schools and we do presentations, and we do have like a Google slide that we use so that it's kind of universal. But I will spend hours adapting the one that the template they gave me for what I'm going to do because I can't do it. Like
Yeah.
I have to work through it so that
Hmm.
I don't look stupid when I'm up there.
Yeah. Yeah. And nobody likes that. Nobody wants that, like to get up there and look.
Like,
Well,
why is this slide here? I don't know. I don't know. What am I supposed to do?
I think when I started just getting really passionate about this particular topic, it started with Reader Come Home by Marianne Wolf. And so as I was reading this book and having conversations with you, Natalie, and with Stephanie Brenner, and then anyone else who would listen to us and talk about it, um, I was I was terrified for kids, and I was terrified for us as a society, and the impact of some of these things on our just our lack of empathy, how technology, when we're on social media, we're not saying technology is a bad thing. It's a tool, should be thought of as a tool. But like the impact on like lack of empathy, it's easy to be passive aggressive behind a keyboard, all of those things. But something that really stuck out to me was developing the reading brain and the importance of when we're developing the reading brain of repeated practice, the importance of us not having distractors and being able to really focus when you read the book How the Brain Learns. It talks so much about the importance of us having like multi-sensory experiences to move things from our immediate memory to our working memory to our long-term memory. So that means we need to touch it, we need to see it, we need to hear it, like touch, feel, hear, all of those things are critical. And so touching the words on a page and going across is really important. Having the book to open is critical. You hear it, you see it, you feel it. All of those things help make connections in the brain that will move the words, that will move the learning more into your long-term memory versus she talks about how we scroll, not just Marianne Wolf, but others we've been reading, how the scrolling like through a text doesn't provide that same experience.
Well, and when you're skimming, you're looking for certain things, and so one of the things that we teach kids is that like nonfiction texts are more challenging, and that
Mm.
the main idea is not necessarily explicit; it's implicit, and you have to read
Yes.
long in a text before it's uncovered. So I was in a classroom recently, and the first like four paragraphs were very negative, but then you
Hmm.
get to like this fifth paragraph and it shifts and it's like
Yeah.
they did this on purpose. They gave you all these negative things and then it shifts to actually like it shifts in a different direction. So you think, oh,
Hmm.
he's totally against the government. And it's like, no, he's not against the government. He just wants a better government. But if you
Better.
didn't keep
Yeah.
reading, you would have missed that. And so
Hmm.
what's happening in digital learning or in digital, and we all do it, like I do, we skim very quickly, or I'll
Hmm.
control F and try to find something on a
Hmm.
text so that I can hone in on it. But I equate that to like taking a verse out of the Bible and saying like, this is what it means. And it's like, oh, you didn't read everything that happened
All
before
the.
and after
Uh-huh.
it. And
Uh-huh.
it actually means something a little bit different than that. It was taken out of
Yeah.
context. And so um I think of that and just to kind of like preface, Carrie and I aren't saying like get rid of digital. All of these books talk about the balance between both. That like you can't
Hmm.
like that we live in a digital world. So we have to teach our kids how to read digitally,
Hmm.
but it shouldn't be the only way that they read. And the benefits that we get, so even as a teacher thinking like, what is it that I want them to do with this text? Because if I want it to transfer into long-term memory, then they probably need a hard copy of it
Hmm.
and they need to be annotating with
Hmm.
their hands and writing. If
Yes.
I just want some exposure to the text, that's a little bit different. So
Yep.
you
Yep.
have to think about what is the end goal for your students because the method that you use is going to impact whether that's transferred or not.
Mhm.
And, I also think about, like, I was watching some students in a classroom and everything was digital, and they were it took them so much longer. Like, and
Mhm.
it was amazing because the kids were talking. They knew that it was in a text. They couldn't remember which one. And because there was like six text sets, they were trying to
Mhm.
dig through and find them all digitally. And they could never, because their Chromebooks were so small, like they could never put both of the text side by side to
Side by side.
compare them. And I'm like,
Mhm.
if they had them on paper, like within 4 seconds, they would have been like, lay them all out. These are the two I need, and they can start
Mhm.
the work. But they spent like a minute and a half just trying to find the document they were looking for and information that they knew it was there, but
Mhm.
they couldn't find it because of all
Mhm.
the tabs that were open on their
That
computer.
were
And
open.
so we think that technology makes things faster or whatever, but it a lot of times it doesn't. Like that, it
Mhm.
takes time to load. It takes, what document was it in, and how many kids have 4,000 documents in their Google
Right.
Drive titled untitled documents.
Yes.
Ugh,
Yes.
like, I have twin
Right.
boys, and I'm like, "Put a title in it. Put the title on it so you know
Right.
where it is and put it in a folder." And they don't, because they're not physically moving them
Mhm.
around. They're just all hanging out there in the cloud. And
Yeah. Oh, perfect segue into the revenge of analog. Okay, so we were talking about, like, digital reading, and one of the things that I found so interesting in this book, and this really isn't a book talk, guys, for those of you who are listening, but we do recommend that you read some of these books and then make your own decisions. Like, you are smart people, right?
Revenge of
Um,
Analog is not really an educational book. It's
not
about
at
a
all.
kid. He spends most of the time talking about records, and I loved it. Like, I absolutely loved
It was really just about how, he talked a lot about, like, the virtual world and the virtual space, and then the real world, like, the concreteness of the real world, and so how, like what Natalie was just saying, that the music and the records, how there's a one sound in the virtual world in the cloud when they're making music, and then but there's a resurgence of people wanting to get back to, like, the authenticity of listening to records. It has a different sound, it has a different experience, different emotions are evoked when you're playing a record than when you're listening to music that's created digitally. And the importance he talked about too, like board games, getting us out of this virtual world that's not like real and concrete. Doesn't feel real and concrete, and bringing us back to the real world. And so he talks about like board games and how getting back to board games, it promotes conversations, it promotes critical thinking. You're moving parts and pieces and cards and things that are on the board game, and
it.
just the joy that brings.
Was it you that I said I would love, like, if I was going back to get my doctorate, I would do a doctoral, my research would be on, like, board game Mondays or something, and
Yeah.
every Monday doing board games in my classroom,
Mhm.
and getting kids to do like critical thinking, problem solving skills with just playing board games. So every Monday, like, give up a day of curriculum every week and just do board games and track that group's progression over the course of the year, and maybe compare their scores from the year before and just see, like, would that change things? Like, would it change relationships in your classroom? Would it allow them to learn how to talk with one another, and be competitive, but in like a good way? Yeah, I don't know.
Right,
I just,
right.
I'm like, oh, I want to do this so bad.
Well, and I think that is like, talk about social emotional learning, learning how to play a game
Oh,
together and navigate the emotions and the feelings that are happening and the decisions, and not being a sore loser, the talk. And I remember this, we were in a classroom together, and at high school, girl said, "I just want to talk. I've been behind a
yes.
computer for 2 years. I don't wanna do this anymore. I
And
wanna
she
talk
was
about my
writing.
learning."
She was
Yeah,
writing, like she was researching about student engagement, and
yeah,
her whole thing was get rid of these stupid computers. Like she was
yes,
like, can we just put this away? High school kid. She was a freshman, I think, and and she
yeah.
was just like, I don't want to be on this. I'm on it all the time, and
Mhm,
I just want to talk to my neighbor. She's like, why can't
mhm.
I just get a pen out and write it? And I'm like, oh, amen.
That's it's exactly like what we're trying to preach is let's get back to pen and paper. Let's get back to reading real books, like looking at an actual book, turning the page, smelling it, experiencing it, annotating the text on paper, not digitally. And that's what they're, which was so interesting in the revenge of the analog. In education, we think that we're preparing kids for like real world relevant experiences by having them on technology. But when you study what they're doing in technology spaces like Google and Facebook and Microsoft, when they're doing deep thinking, when they're doing creative work, there is not a piece of technology in sight. They have whiteboards, they have paper, they have markers in different colors. They get rid of all of that and do the hard work, and then they figure out how to build it in their technology space. But that's the last thing they do. They don't have the technology at the center. And so I think that that's something that's really interesting that we need to consider as educators when we're thinking about preparing kids for the future and real world relevance. Kids need to talk, they need to create, they need to
Well,
learn,
I
they need
think
to annotate.
in that book he kind of, I feel like it's in there, but he kind of talks about how um, the technology becomes a hindrance in that creativity stage, because as soon as you
Mhm,
start putting it on the computer, you want it to look like the final product. So you spend so much time on the layout and the design and the prettiness that you're not getting the thoughts and ideas down. And so I think about that in a classroom, that when a kid starts typing on a Google Doc and they get all these little squiggly lines that tell them that they're spelling things wrong, they
mhm,
stop their creative juices and they go back and they start trying to grammatically fix
fix
everything,
it.
and then they never get anywhere. And so it's like,
Yep,
no, like it's supposed to be messy. Like, it's almost, and it's crazy because I know that some English teachers would want to punch me for saying this, but it's like, I almost want to look at them and say, don't put a capital letter, don't put a period, just write. Like, just start writing and get all your thoughts down, and
mhm,
then come back and flush out those pretty details, which, again, depending, I'm not saying to handwrite especially at the secondary level. I'm not saying to handwrite everything, like rough drafts and all of that stuff, because you definitely like that would be very frustrating for a kid to do a flash draft on paper and then have to transfer that flash draft into typing to then flush out. Like,
mhm, mhm,
you gotta have some common sense somewhere in there. It's not an end all be all.
mhm,
But there is that layer there that I do it all the time. Like, if I as soon as I get on the computer, I spend so much time, like, if I just put a table in a document and I was
mhm.
like, do I need four columns or three columns?
Yeah,
And you spend so much time on trying to figure out if you need four columns or three columns
mhm,
that you're like, oh my God, I could have had this whole thing finished. And I'm spending time on the layout and like color,
mhm,
like the look of it.
mhm,
And so I do think that that's a hindrance. And so, like, literally all that stuff that I was doing on there, I wrote it all down on paper first. So that I'm
mhm.
like, now I know what my compartments kind of look like on paper,
Yeah,
and I can
yeah.
transfer it, and it was much faster.
Much faster that way. Well, and I think, I know we could talk and talk and talk about this, but you just made me think about when you were talking about secondary students like typing on the computer. What we'll see in elementary is when in writer's workshop, when they're trying to type out their stories, it's taking so long to hunt and peck for them that their thoughts get it's just it is so laborious for them to get a sentence or a word down on paper. Where when we think about volume, I would like to see like 20 sentences in 10 minutes at least when I'm thinking like third, fourth graders. But when they're writing, they can do that. When they're actually like on the computer and typing, we'll be lucky if they get one, maybe two sentences. And so it just really stifles that volume, and volume reading, volume writing is repeated practice. That's how we get better is through practice. And I think circling back to earlier when we were talking about how the teachers are doing all the work and we're like that dependency cycle trying to scaffold so much. Natalie does a really nice job talking about like attending a practice and what that looks like. When kids aren't getting that repeated practice, they're not going to learn or get better or have that automaticity that they need as a reader or a writer. So, Natalie, can you talk just for a second about that practice analogy that you do?
Oh, so like I always, it's a great analogy to make it secondary because most secondary teachers are coaches or have been coaches at some point in their
Mhm.
life. And
Mhm.
so we talk about if I were a football coach, like, or if I were whatever, like if I walk onto the football field, who's doing the work? Like if
Mhm.
I'm trying to prepare my kids for a game for Friday night, are we sitting in a room watching game film all week long? Am I standing up showing them how to throw the ball and how to do the play, or are they
Mhm.
actually so um who's doing the work? And it's like
Yeah.
everybody's response is, well, the coach is sitting on the sideline with his khakis blowing his whistle and the kids are on the field. And if
Mhm.
they weren't on the field doing the plays and being coached up from the sidelines, then they're not going to be successful on Friday night. And you're
Mhm.
actually, you would, as a coach, it would be a liability. If you send them out there on Friday night and they have not once practiced all week and they just watch game film, you should be sued. You're not doing your job because you're going to put them out there in harm's way. And
Yeah.
so we should be looking at education and our classrooms that exact same way, like who's doing the work.
Mhm.
And um, if I have a 42-minute practice, my kids should be on the field for 42 minutes of that. But we know that that's not possible. They sometimes they do need some guidance, but you know, 30 minutes at least in a 42-minute classroom,
Yeah.
they should
Yeah.
be doing the work without
For
you
sure.
interrupting them, like letting
Yeah.
them work through it and fail, and then stepping
Mhm.
back and being like, what worked, what went well, what didn't go so
Mhm.
well, what would you change? Let's try it again. Like, and then going
Mhm.
at it again.
For
Um,
sure.
there's one piece of advice I could give to any educator out there, and it would be ask yourself, like, what does learning look like to you when you are learning something? And
Mhm.
when you're reading, what does reading look like? What does learning look like? Are you doing it in isolation? Are you taking notes? I love asking these questions because when you start talking about that, you're going to say things like, when I read a book that I think is interesting, what do I do? I call Carrie and I say, hey, Carrie, I'm reading this book. I
Mhm.
recently was with a district that's a very conservative district and they're in a rural area. And I came across this, it's a Christian based author, but he doesn't like preach God or anything like that, but like it's very clean cut, wholesome, but still
Mhm.
tackles some world issues. And I was like, immediately, I'm like, this would be a text or an author that maybe you would feel comfortable showing to some of your students because
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
does tackle real world things, but there's no cussing in it. It does talk a little, at the high school level, it does talk a little bit about sex, but like it does it in a very clean, respectful way.
Yeah.
And so immediately, like I knew who I wanted to share that
That's so
author
cool.
with.
Mhm.
And so it's
Mhm.
like that's what we do when we come across things as learners. We want to share. We want to talk to someone else. We want someone else to experience it with us so that we can get their thoughts and see if they're thinking the
Mhm.
same thing or if they have a different take on it. And if
Yeah.
that's how we're learning, if we're not creating those same environments for our
Mhm.
students, then we're really doing them a disservice because we're teaching them how to do school. We're not teaching them how to do
Mhm.
life.
Yeah.
And so if we sat down for 5 minutes or 2 minutes and we chatted, like, what does learning look like to me? And am
Mhm.
I replicating this in my classroom? Am I teaching my students or giving my kids opportunities to learn this way?
I would encourage I think for me, some of the most powerful I've done a couple things that I found to be incredibly powerful and reflective as a teacher. One is to videotape myself when I teach and then watch myself, like the language I use, the gestures, the classroom, and you can videotape yourself from the back, like have it set up so you can see the kids and then study like what does engagement look like for them and when do I seem to be losing them? And so I think that was really powerful for me. having a coach by my side. I truly believe in the impact of coaching. So I've always had coaches that I've worked with to help me become a better educator. But I would encourage people to take on the perspective of a student and spend time in classrooms. Like, what does a day look like for a high school kid? And go through their 6 to 9, depending how many where you're at, how many periods they have, but go with them through their day and see what learning looks like for them. Or in an elementary classroom and how they have to start and stop and start and stop and start and stop in elementary and in secondary as they're changing classes or as they're changing subjects. And that's exhausting. So, and then sitting is exhausting. Watching is exhausting. I've never ever heard or been to a professional development that I'm like, yes, we have a PowerPoint. They're going to turn out the lights today. It's going to be a great day. Like, I've never once done that. I don't know about you, Dr. Fallert, but I've heard moans and groans and people complaining, but yet sometimes I feel like I've done that or we've done that, and I love the advice of thinking about how we learn and then try to create those same kind of experiences, for our kids. So for sure, for sure, I love that. Well, always, yeah, keeping that focus on why are we here, who are we trying to impact, and how are we impacting them? So it's great advice. Thank you so much for this time together. It was really fun, and I promise I'll buy my own books and give you your books back.
That's all right. I love to share. So,
You are a
and
sharer.
which is funny because we really just modeled what we do whenever we learn. Like, I read this book and I was like, oh, I want you to read this book. I think you should read this. And then you were like, I want to read it.
For
And I'm
sure.
like, here it is. So,
Yeah, it's been a great journey just learning and thinking through like the impact of technology on kids and on ourselves. So we do highly recommend those books. Again, Reader Come Home, The Revenge of Analog. I recommend How the Brain Learns. Have
and
a
I
great day,
think
everyone. Oh
to
yeah,
your
go.
just recap, like, we're not saying technology's bad. Like,
No.
but we are we're being good practitioners and we're researching both sides and we're saying that it's
Mhm.
not the end all be all. And how do you find that balance
Yeah.
between um both of those worlds, and
Hmm.
doing some research to know the impact of both worlds.
For sure, for sure. And I think our colleague April Burton, she is amazing when it comes to learning how to use technology purposefully as a tool. So check out her stuff because she's really engaging. She makes it very purposeful, useful, a way that kids can create, share their learning. So we love that. We just need to think about some of the other areas. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. But all right. Thanks so much, Dr. Fowler.
Thank you.